BlockchainGov is a 5 years long transdisciplinary research effort aimed at restoring trust in institutions and communities on a global level by promoting and studying better on-chain and off-chain distributed governance practices. We study not only new network sovereignties, but also topics like blockchain constitutionalism, so the ideas of having constitution to regulate and govern decentralized communities, or the idea of polycentrism. And I will leave the link to our social media in the chat so that if you are curious, you can see more. And yeah, today we're gonna have two presentations on the topic. One by Primavera de Filippi and Sofia Cossar. There's gonna be an introduction on the new network sovereignties research track here at BlockchainGov, and on the proposal, let's say the proposal of Coordi-Nations. And then one by myself, exploring the one particular case, that is the case of maybe it's a network state, we're gonna see, Prospera, that is a private city built in Nicaragua, and the conflict between the Nicaraguan state and this private city. So we're gonna see a little bit more in detail what happened there, what is happening still actually, and how this can influence our study of these new sovereign entities. Honduras, pardon. So I think without Honduras. Without further ado, I think we can start with the presentation by Sofia and Primavera. And yeah, I'm gonna shut up.
Let me see. Can you see the slides, everyone?
Yeah.
And can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Then Prima, you can take the floor.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Ali has done the introduction of BlockchainGov, so I don't think we need to spend too much time on it, but essentially the idea with BlockchainGov is that we're looking at distributed governance from three specific trajectories. One is community governance, so we're looking specifically on how blockchain communities are governing and coordinating themselves, and so we have like a bunch of ethnographic work that is being done on this thing. We also look at distributed governance and blockchain applied to institutions, so trying to understand like how we can have systems of regulatory equivalence, regulatory compliance by adopting blockchain technology. And then the third track, which is the most relevant for this discussion, is global governance. And so trying to understand how the concept of distributed governance that we have observed at the local level, at the community level, and the various institutional framework that are also abiding by those different principles or technologies, how this can help us come up with new mechanisms or just observe models of distributed governance that happen at the global level that somehow transcend the traditional international law frameworks that has already been explored a lot. And this is kind of how this whole concept of new network sovereignties emerged, initially driven as a way of contrasting from the description that were adopted for network states, but then extrapolating the concept much broader into really looking at all the forms of network sovereignty that are emerging in recent years, but also in the past, and trying to conceptualize it, theorize it, identify both at the theoretical levels and theoretical framework, but also at the more empirical level, observing what is happening on the ground. So, you know, Honduras being potentially, Prospera being potentially one of those, and then normatively also trying to come up with specific recipes for specific types of new network sovereignties that we think are potentially interesting to explore. So yeah, I think that's enough for BlockchainGov, and I pass it to you, Sofia.
Yes, so thank you everyone for joining this call. My name is Sofia. Yeah, so I will be talking a little bit about the history and the concept of new network sovereignties, and then I will pass it to Prima to explain the flavor of coordinations, and then I will be presenting the exercise to then be followed by Alessandro's presentation of Prospera. So I will repeat a little bit of what Primavera just said. The reason or the context in which the concepts of new network sovereignties and coordinations emerge is one of governance and technology researchers and builders of network communities of care with a shared interest in new and emancipatory forms of collective self-organization coming together. Many of them being together today in this call: Silke, Lou, I think Jessica should be here too, Morshed, and etc. So the elephant in the room that we do have to mention is that obviously the release of Balaji's Network State book was a catalyst for these collective exercise, because many of us went from excitement about the book to a partial agreement with the problem statement to a bit of a disagreement with the proposed framework of Balaji. So that led in 2022 and 2023 to the podcast series called The Overthrowing the Network State that was led by the blockchain socialists and BlockchainGov, particularly Primavera. And in 2023, many of us, around 40, 50 of us, gathered at the Coordi-Nations workshop at Zuzalo. And that led to the publication of a Medium post explaining the concept of coordinations. Since then, many of us continue to research and trying to define these two concepts. And well, you will be working on this even further throughout the year. So again, something Primavera mentioned before is that this is a sort of threefold exercise. On the one hand, it is empirical because we want to observe real-world examples of network sovereignties challenging the sovereignty status quo, but it is also conceptual because we believe that the frameworks developed up to now don't really explain what is happening and what could happen in the future. That is the reason why this is also a normative exercise where we want to help co-design pathways for the emergence of new network sovereignties that particularly are embedded in principles such as mutualism, cosmolocalism, and solidarity. So up to now, and I want to make sure that I communicate this clearly. We have been going back and forth on how we defined these two concepts individually in relation to one another. So this is a way of presenting the definition of new network sovereignties today, but we have not always agreed on the presentation that I'm going to describe right now. But let's first start from the perspective that this exercise began with us trying to understand the differences between three models. The first one is one we all already know, the Westphalian nation states. The second one, as I explained before, is a Balajian network state. And the third one is the one we developed in 2023, which is coordinations. And we identified that this model had different histories and components and different versions of power transfer. However, even if we're in disagreement of Model 2, we do recognize that Model 2 and 3 may be new expressions of sovereignty. So new network sovereignties become an umbrella term encompassing many expressions. I'm putting coordinations here, network states. Potentially some people also talk about DAOs, we could see, but today we will analyze particularly the case of charter cities. The common feature up to now that we could maybe agree, like the minimum viable product of new network sovereignties, is that if we look at the definition of sovereignty, so the power, authority, and capacity to dictate our own affairs, these types of models don't need to be a granted legal status, but is more of a self-owned practice. It doesn't need to be recognized under international law, like in the case of nation states. It doesn't need to be backed by the monopoly of the use of force, but it is rather a desire and an ability to collectively shape the affairs of a collective. So sovereignty also is not exclusive to entities that share similar features, because this is something that happens in the Westphalian system. The sovereigns are only other nation states, and they recognize each other in that way. So for the new network sovereignties, there is no ultimate sovereign, but multiple coexisting ones. In this framework, the new network sovereignties don't want to replace the nation state, but live in parallel or on top of them. Now we will look a little bit further into the coordinations as a specific flavor of new network sovereignties, and Prima, I give you the floor to explain a little further.
Thank you. Yeah, so the concept of coordination, originally the name was intended to contrast the idea that we are not trying to replicate a state, but rather we want to focus on the nation side of nation states. And essentially the idea is to try and explore like how can we create new institutional frameworks for those entities which are called now digital nation, if we don't want, but basically those community that do not recognize themselves as a nation because of territorial proximity, but because of other type of proximity, kinship, and so forth. And so essentially, if we look at currently, like what are the various means that we have to coordinate communities, we have like the public sector, which is usually implemented via nation state, which have the monopoly of violence over a particular territory and which provides some degrees of public services and infrastructure to the citizen. On the other side, we have the private sector, which is providing essentially goods and services to consumer. So one is very oriented towards the territory, whereas goods and service, of course, sometimes are territorial, but most of the time they transcend a particular locality. Yeah, and then what we can see is that there is a particular type of goods and services which are not inherently connected with a territory. And that's the case, for instance, of education, of welfare, of like a variety of things that are considered to be public service because we consider that the state needs to provide this type of services to the citizens, but that doesn't have to be. And in fact, we can see how increasingly over time, the private sector is somehow entering into that scope. And we have like, especially in the US more so than Europe perhaps, but you know, private insurance for welfare, we have private universities and so forth. And so those, while there are some things that are exclusive to the private sector and some things that are exclusive to the public sector, there's things that are kind of like competing with one another for those middle ground services. And then what's interesting is when we look at the way in which Balaji has described the network state, it is basically bringing the private sector all the way down to the territory and basically acquiring like starting to compete with the nation states also at the level of the more territorially bound services. And then, so what we want to do with coordination is to try and actually bring back the role of the civil society and basically communities of people, which could be territorial or non-territorial, but basically people that recognize themselves as a particular community of kinship and that therefore have an interest in also providing for one another those services that stands in the middle. So ensuring that everyone feels good, ensuring that everyone acquires the necessary knowledge and so forth. So this middle layer that is now in that we have like both the private sector and the public sector competing for those, we want to add a new actor that is not abiding by the rules of the public sector nor the private sector, but according to a new system of organization, which is what we call coordinations. So within the scope of coordination, essentially, like, so in the same way as like Balaji came up with this little description of what is a network, which people might agree or disagree with the definition, but we try to come up with like specific principle that we think a coordination should abide at. So first of all, it is opt-in. So you join a coordination because you decide to join it. You are not born into coordination. So it is inherently participatory and non-coercive because you also can leave at any time. The governance is polycentric, so there is not one single authority or governmental powers that are managing and coordinating the coordination, but rather it is done with a cluster of different decision-making nodes that find different ways of coordinating with one another. And then as opposed to the concept of subsidiarities, where the idea is that we need to delegate power from the top to the bottom until we reach that particular entity that is capable, that is the most apt to deal with a particular issue. But obviously, when we start from the top, there is always a tendency of wanting to maintain the power and delegating less than what is actually optimal. Coordination relies on the opposite principle of supersidiarity, which is we start from the bottom, we start from the smallest possible entity, and we move up by voluntary agreement of delegating power to a higher level structure in order to achieve the necessary variety and the necessary capacity to implement a particular action that requires collective action. And then, so in terms of membership, so who are the participants to a coordination? So again, membership is voluntary, so you have to choose to opt in into it. And then it is based on this concept of people recognizing that there is an alignment, that there is shared values, a common vision, a common societal vision. There is also like some kind of understanding that we are sharing a future together and a desire to share the future together. So the animating purpose of the people that belong to the same coordination are converging towards this societal future. And yeah, so while there is obviously well, the research was born, of course, with like to which extent can we use new technology to support coordination. The concept of coordination is not something that is defined by the technology, but of course, because it is networked, then it definitely can be supported and facilitated through network technology, decentralized technology because of the polycentricity of it. So the idea is to look at how novel technology today enable the emergence of new governance structure that perhaps would be very difficult to achieve without those technologies, but without falling for the narrowing down of the definition of coordination to being like a technological tool. And then, yeah, so exit, so because it is voluntary participation, it is both voluntary to come in and voluntary to leave. However, that doesn't mean that exit is necessarily costless. There are ways in which people might, by coming into a coordination, they might actually stake themselves to a particular extent, so that exit will require a cost, but that's also part of the framework of ensuring a more cohesive coordination. But of course, there is no rules that prevent from leaving, and it's just a choice of to which extent do someone wants to incur the cost of exit associated. And then, so the way the operations of those coordination is basically based on a series of principles as well. So one is like mutualism, which is basically the idea that by putting resources together, we might actually be able to do better. One, because we can support people that maybe have less resources, but also because we can engage in collective action through the mutualization of resources, which can enhance the capacity. So like the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts. The concept of cosmolocalism, which was developed by Michel Bauwens, which is essentially the idea where the knowledge and like everything that is not based on atoms is global, and everything that is actually atom-based, physical, is local. right? So as opposed to globalization, which is actually exporting production in every places in the world. So it's like you're actually moving atoms around. The idea with cosmolocalism is to actually promote local production, local consumption, but enabling intellectual resources and potentially financial resources or everything that can easily travel without requiring expensive transportation costs to actually be done and shared at the global level. Self-reliance, essentially trying to minimize dependencies on external actors and increasing interdependencies among the different actors of the coordination, and then solidarity.
Before passing to the next slide, can I reconnect for a second the presentation? Just 1 second. Because it's not syncing on my side. Okay. We can continue now.
Okay, and then the question of like how coordination do actually interact with other actors. And so coordination as a cluster of actors, so the nodes that are part of the coordination. The idea is that they should be autonomous in the sense that they do not depend on any other actor or on the coordination itself. Yet they are interconnected, so interdependent and so forth, meaning that there is a voluntary choice to become interdependent, which of course might slightly reduce the autonomy once the interconnection is done, but it is understood as a voluntary practice in order to extend the capacity of each one of those nodes. And then the idea also that as opposed to traditional system where when we think about scaling, we're thinking about increasing the size of one particular system, to which like generally creates like governance questions about what, how do we create like proper representation of everyone. The idea with the coordination is that they scale in a fractal manner. So this doesn't require one large coordination to encompass all the actors, but rather creating networks and then network of networks and then network of networks, etc. And so you can still maintain the autonomy of every individual nodes that interconnect with one another, but then one interconnected group can itself become one node into a larger ecosystem. And yeah, and the idea then to increase the interdependency, not seeing interdependency as a problem that we want to eliminate. That is more like the more libertarian exit-based approach, but rather recognizing that we are all interdependent and actually interdependence can be positive and therefore to some extent trying to maximize interdependencies because interdependencies also provide more capacity, extend the capacity of individual actors. And then how do coordination interact with the outside world? So based on system theory, basically coordination are operationally closed. That means that they are self-contained within their own system. However, they are functionally open, meaning that they maintain some kind of APIs with the external world, and they are capable of interacting and transacting and potentially absorbing or rejecting some actor. And of course, these imply a dynamic relationship where coordination needs to be able to mutually adjust to changes in the environment, but that meaning therefore that they need to be well aware and properly interconnected with the environment as well in order to evolve accordingly. Yeah. And then how do they interact with network states specifically? So this is also as a way of like distinguishing coordination from the Balaji definition of network state. So there is multiple ways in which this interaction with nation state can be done. One is actually some more like collaborative system of like finding ways in which the coordination can help a particular nation state and vice versa can be helped by it. One is more about like a defensive approach. So actually recognizing that there are some elements within a nation state that are not compatible or compliant or that are not aligned with the values of a coordination, and therefore the coordination could try to lobby and identify ways in which it can actually push towards a change in the way in which or into some aspect of in the way in which the nation state operates. Or there is the beyonders approach, which is more about finding ways to exist and coexist in a neutral manner and just building something on the side that tries actually to interact the least with the network state. And if they have to interact, they create this necessary membrane to not let the nation state actually be able to enter into enter and affect the way in which this the coordination operates. This is what in executional theory we call exclosures, which is essentially finding ways to create or to carve out spaces of freedom. And the way in which the safest way to carve out spaces of freedom within an enclosed territory is to actually speak the same language of territory. So the best way to exclose from a particular legal rule is to actually speak the language of the law and create a particular legal structure that protects you against the law being able to get in, because the only way that the law will be able to get into this membrane is actually violating its own rules. And so the one interesting track that we are exploring within the context of coordination is to which extent coordination can be regarded as exclosure or can create themselves internal exclosure so that they can operate alongside a network state, a nation states, and find ways to collaborate with the nation state where it is possible, find ways to counteract some aspect of the network of the nation state when this is necessary, but also be able to carve out the spaces of freedom so that they can coexist without being interfered with by the nation states. Okay, then again, mapping from Balaji's recipe of how to build a network state, we try to come up with a recipe to how to build a coordination. So 7 steps. First one is identifying. So coordinations are collective of collectives, right? So it is not just a community, but it is a network of communities. So the first step is identifying a community that people feel aligned with, they feel kinship with, or if they don't find one, but just build one. So creating a community where all the actors within that community are affiliated with a sense of kinship. Secondly, finding and identifying other communities that also share kinship amongst each other. So in order to create this network of community, we need to find communities that share the same societal values, that want to share a future together, and so forth. And then experimenting with initial relationship where because there is this kinship and because there is a mutual desire of achieving a particular societal vision, there is a desire of actually fostering and supporting the work of others. And so finding ways in which different communities can support one another in a bilateral or multilateral manner, meaning that if there is a community that has a lot of resources of one type, then they can share some of the resources with another community that perhaps lacks those particular resources but have many of other things. And so finding ways in which we can create like a mesh of bilateral or multilateral relationship to ensure that every community can operate as they wish. And then step number 4, which is very important, which is the naming into existence, which is there is a point in which all those communities that keeps creating this little mesh of collaborations might actually either start recognizing themselves or be recognized by others as a collective entity. And these require, of course, a reference. So these require having a particular name for that collective that people can refer to. And the fact that we can now refer to a collective means that the collective as a conceptual entity has come into existence. And then because now we have this collective entity, then all of a sudden, instead of relying on those bilateral relationships in order to support one another, it is now possible to mutualize resources around that collective. And so instead of finding who is needing what that one community has extra of, it's about like, okay, let's actually, all the resources we have in extra that we don't need, let's put them together, let's mutualize, let's pool the resources in this common pool, and then manage them collectively. And of course, these require an initial degree of governance to be implemented. And then next step, because now we have a collective entity which has mutualized resources, then instead of individual actors acting in their own names, now they can do collective action. The new collective that has been created can now leverage the resources that has been mutualized in order to act on behalf of itself. And so again, these require much more governance now, because it's not just about mutualizing and sharing resources, but it's also about what do we want to do with those resources. But basically, of course, augmenting the capacity to act, because if it's always the same actor that is doing the action, then it has like a much larger impact and visibility than if it's a lot of divergent little actors that are acting in without the collective action framework. And then the last one, which is perhaps the most important, the most interesting, and the most challenging, is there is a point in which we want to move away from just having a network of, or a collectivity of actors that are mutualizing resources and acting on behalf of the collective, but we want to make sure that those entities actually become more and more interwoven with one another, to the point in which it becomes actually difficult to distinguish, like it's no longer just a collection of actors that makes a collective, but it's actually one single interwoven tapestry of actors, which of course becomes intrinsically interconnected and interdependent, but that's also what increases the capacity of each. And these require, and that's where the challenge comes in, this requires identifying, depending on the type of communities, what this interweaving looks like. What is the blood of those individual entities that can be shared, so that there is like this sense of kinship that becomes really, really strong. And of course, this means that also these significantly start increasing the cost of exit, because it's much harder to disentangle oneself from this tapestry, rather than if you're just part of a collective and you can just choose not to be a member anymore.
Okay, so now the exercise. Thank you, Prima, for explaining the concept of coordinations. So to go back to the beginning, we mentioned that new network sovereignties is an umbrella term, and within coordinations fits within it. Network states also fit within it. And today we will talk about charter cities. Ale may also make the case that charter cities, so this specific one is a proto-network state. But some of the questions that came to mind that maybe we can discuss all together is, number one, how does Prospera as a charter city or proto-network state fit into the framework of new network sovereignties in terms of its governance, membership, development, interrelationships, the components we mentioned before when talking about coordinations? And number two, can charter cities ever be considered a node of a specific type of new network sovereignty? And particularly whether, or perhaps what is the role that territory plays in charter cities? What is the role that defensive and antagonistic strategies with the outsiders play in charter cities, as illuminated in the case of Prospera? So I will stop here and then give the floor to Ale and his presentation.
Yes, just give me one sec. All right. Okay, do you see my screen, right? Yes. Okay, I'll try to be faster just because I think we don't have too much time left. So Prospera, a network state story. Okay, so what is Prospera? Prospera is a semi-autonomous city established under Honduran Zone for Employment and Economic Development, also known as ZID, through these laws on the island of Roatan. It was founded by Eric Bremen and Gabriel Delgado through the private company known as Honduras Prospera Inc. It also received the founding of Balaji himself, Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel, and other famous venture capital organization. And as we were talking about before, it may make the case for a proto-network state, although the particular case of Prospera, I think it makes us question some of the ideas behind the network state. And most of all, it shows, I mean, I read this case through the lenses of like the power of infrastructural investment and power and their relationship with the legal system of a sovereign state. So how can we, or like how is it entity like Prospera built upon the structure of a sovereign state like Honduras? So the ZID law, I think it's important for us to understand how this whole initiative came about, to also grasp a bit better and like to situate the ideas of network state and how and where they happen. So the ZID law were immediately deemed as controversial, and they required real political and legal muscles to pass into force in Nicaragua. These two guys were the principal political actors supporting these laws. One was, you don't see my screen anymore? Or...
We can see it.
Okay, okay. So yeah, one was the president that proposed the law, Porfirio Lobo Sousa, in charge from 2010 and up until 2014, who gained power after a US-backed coup. And the other guy is his successor, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was, at the time that the law was proposed, the president of the main Honduras legislative body, that is the National Congress, and then was the successor as president after Sousa finished his term. So the ZID law was first deemed as unconstitutional by the country's Supreme Court in 2012. After that, the Supreme Court and the government have had a very tense political standoff that led to the removal of 4 judges and the approval of like 4 new judges that were like, they had sympathies with the government, so to say, and they then led to the approval of the law in 2014. That was at the end of like Sousa like term. After that, and when Hernandez takes power, he stays in power from 2014 up until 2022. The law was applied, and various ZIDs program across the country, included Prospera, were initiated. An important note also for the development that followed the law coming into power, it was the fact that ZIDs were designed to be unrepairable for like 50 years. And this was made, like, was designed, this mechanism, to give foreign investors the necessary confidence to invest. Another side comment that I think it's important, again, to contextualize the story of Prospera, that is very peculiar in its own, like, geographical and political situation, is that on the 8th of March 2024, the former President Hernandez was convicted of 3 counts of drugs trafficking and weapons conspiracy, and he faces a mandatory minimum sentence of 40 years in prison. It was extradited to the United States and is now, I think, in prison. So this tells us something about, I think, the particular context in which the story of Prospera took place. Following that, in 2021, however, the law came into force, and so the Prospera construction could finally happen, and the city began to be built and to attract capital investments. Oh, there's a typo there. It attracted like millions of investments, but it also immediately like caused and ignited like strong backlash and protest against the initiatives from the local population. plus accusation of violation of human rights, and one can say ecocide, so like no respect for the ecosystem and the natural condition of Nicaragua. And this, Honduras, pardon me, I don't know why I'm saying Nicaragua. These conditions led to a strong, like, against political opposition with ONGs and like local political movement building a counter, like a resistance, a movement against the coming to power of the ZID law and the loss of sovereignty, because this was deemed as such, as a loss of sovereignty of the Honduras state, and with the creation of this new special economic zone. The idea behind these economic zones and charter city and the construction of a charter city like Prospera was inspired by like various train of thoughts that I think also influenced the idea of itself of network state. And if you look at the Prospera website, for example, the case of Dubai is directly mentioned and like showed, and also Shanghai is mentioned. And generally the fact that by creating special economic zones that are like have different legal frameworks, one can attract a rapid economical development. That is something that cannot happen in developing countries, according to the like promoters of ZIDs, obviously. Then what happened? It happened that let's say the political wind changed, and after the previous president left the power, Xiomara Castro was elected as first woman president of Honduras. She was the first lady before, let's say, all of these, like the previous two presidents were conservatives. So before they came into power, her husband was actually the president that was like kicked out by the coup. And she promised to fight corruption and to adopt a less, let's say, liberal economic policy and more democratic socialist. So, of course, one of the pillars of her campaign was to repeal the law that allowed ZIDs into Honduras territory, and to basically show support for the popular protests that were rising. Another interesting note, I will say, is that after she came to power, so the elections were in late 2021 and she took office in early 2022, a bipartisan note was released by the US senators from both parties to call on the State Department and Blinken to protect the US investments in Prospera and to be careful, let's say, like to pay attention on what Castro would have done to, let's say, unfold the current development of Prospera. In a way, let's say, they were right to worry, because the new president started to repeal the law that allowed ZID into existence on the national territory of Honduras. And then what happened? Then the fight, let's say, that this conflict that was political took like a legal level that we think it's very interesting. And also in a private BlockchainGov seminar, our colleague Morshed like really showed us in its like interesting character. So the Prospera Inc, the company behind the charter city of Prospera, submitted a notice of intent to arbitration to this organization called XID, which is International Center for Settlement of Investment Dispute. And basically Prospera appealed to the Dominican Republic, Central America, United States Free Trade Agreement. The International Center for Settlement of Investment Dispute is an entity existing within the World Bank, and they appealed to this International Free Trade Agreement to basically, we can say, try to get compensation for the losses that they would have incurred in due to what they perceived being a breach of their rights and commitment made in Honduras. Particularly, they asked for more than $10 billion that are 2/3 of the country annual budget as a compensation against the state, especially because of President Castro's intention of, as I said, like roll back the law that allowed the ZID into existence and consequently basically to shut down the Prospera project. Then what happened? It happened like the conflict escalated even more, this legal fight escalated even more, because the Castro government took the, one can say, brave political decision to gradually withdraw. This happened in the March of this year, 2024. arbitration organ, and they decided to gradually withdraw from it in response, of course, to the compensation request from Prospera. If this request would have will it find its own way to be realized, basically the state will be bankrupt. So this move was actually applauded by the Progressive International, that is, as you can imagine, a left-leaning organization, with a letter signed by many admired and renewed economists, including Yanis Varoufakis, for example, applauding the present move as a, let's say, act of defense of the Honduran democracy and the step towards sustainable development, and a challenge, I would say, towards the dominance of corporation in international corporate law. This is to say that is not the only case where something similar has happened, as is it highlighted in this letter by the Progressive International. They also mention other cases, like the European Union recently announcing its withdrawal from the Energy Charter Treaty, or the President Biden also pledging to not have provisions for these corporate cards in future trade deals. And that's why there is this picture with Lula, the president of Brazil. Big developing countries as Brazil and India, for example, always resisted this kind of treaties. And they never basically participated in them. So the move of Honduras is not only specific to this case, and the fight, let's say, against Prospera Inc. is also an instance of something bigger. What is happening now is that this is all still unfolding. Honduras might exit the treaty by August, yet this exit is not retroactive. So they could still be bound to respect arbitration outcomes, including the ongoing cases, meaning that they will have to pay the compensation to the Prospera Inc. company. And this is the current state of the case. And I just want to draw some quick conclusions, or temporary conclusions, given that it's all still unfolding. Again, inspired by the seminar we had with Morshad some weeks ago. So the Prospera dispute, these three books are let's say, good coordination tools, one can say, in this world matter, at least for me. The Prospera disputes highlight, I think, a tension between the rule of law and the actual development of the rule of man. So with the rule of law, I'm not a legal scholar, you will have to pardon me. It's rule of law is the set of procedures and legal frameworks within which the legal system works. And basically the idea that we are all the same in front of the law, and the cascading consequences starting from this principle. The fact is that the Prospera specific configuration, and we can see this configuration as a proto-network state, so network states in the future, or actually at the moment, also may have a similar power. Prospera occupied quasi-extra-statewide space, as is not properly outside of the state, but it exists on top of it, thanks to sovereign state laws that came into power with very, let's say, controversial moves, but still they were legal laws of Honduras. Prospera was able to challenge the rule of law of a sovereign state like Nicaragua, and is able to challenge it right now, thanks to this infrastructural power, the amount of investments that came into the country through Prospera, the physical infrastructure that was built, and also the international treaties were used to challenge the traditional legal framework, and this is what this very nice book that I suggest, Extra Statecraft, by the architect and scholar Keller Esterling, is she's arguing for the fact that it exists a power of the infrastructural space. And I think this is very important in understanding also how network states, and on the other hand, even coordination, they came to be through the existence also infrastructural, an infrastructural layer. And also this last book, Crack Up Capitalism, explains, argues for this idea of crack up capitalism as the dream of circumventing democracy, and the democracy that is established through the rule of law, I would say, by acting as market radicals and even exactly by leveraging this set of possibilities that are within like the economic and financial space, within international treaty space, to challenge the sovereignty of a state on its own territory. And yeah, I will stop right here. Yeah, there are also some links I can share in the chat if you want to learn more about the whole story. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. I think like maybe because we have like not so much time before Felix will take over with the residency. Let's try and actually have just like short questions, comments, and feedback for like 5-10 minutes max.
Yes.
Does anyone wants to add something about either the Coordi-Nations New Network Sovereignty concepts or about Alessandro's presentation?
Maybe I could ask a couple of questions. In fact, bringing us back to the beginning where you posted some, actually, I wondered to what extent you see this case as either a coordination or a network state, or none of the above, something else. But like, what does this example bring to the theory now that it's one of the few practical quasi-network states? How do you think it really enriches the theoretical part?
I think that's a very good question. This is exactly what we were asking ourselves before the presentation.
What are your conclusions so far?
I will say like, so if we take like the from like a conceptual perspective, like if we forget Honduras as a particular case study, but more like the concept of new network sovereignty is perceived as this, or the way we're trying to articulate it, because we came up with the term, is the idea of having this large overarching framework of something that encompasses all the new types of new network sovereignties, right? Which implies network sovereignties. The coordination, as we described it today, and the network state as it has been described by Balaji, will both be two potential instantiation of a new network sovereignty. And then I think the question with Charter City, which is interesting because it's obviously part of the same large community of discussion, but charter cities do not necessarily have an intention to be networked, right? And I think that's where the distinction comes about. As a collective of charter cities that were to try and coordinate themselves as a collective entity, then might emerge to be either a network state or a coordination, depending on the mechanism that they choose to govern themselves, and in which case they will fit within the overarching framework of new network sovereignties. But Prospera by itself is nothing more than a charter city. It doesn't necessarily, yet at least, has any intention or communication about trying to become networked with other charter cities around the world.
Do you think it's a legal exclosure? Because basically it uses the law, like very, very old law indeed, to get where it is right now.
Yeah, I think it's actually, it has tried to create an exclosure. I think the ZID is an exclosure, like was created to provide those charter cities the possibility of actually creating, like carving out some spaces of freedom. And then the new government has broken the exclosure. And of course, like it's a very interesting case of like, an exclosure only works to the extent that the external system does not violate its own rules, right? And Honduras has chosen to modify its own rules in order to penetrate into the exclosure. And now there is this question of to which extent can they be held responsible for that or not? But yeah, I think it was an exclosure, and now the membrane of the exclosure is getting weaker, and I guess Prospera is trying to fight for its membrane.
Still has the international investment law one membrane. Because, you know, like, I think this arbitral systems are in that sense exclosures.
Which systems are?
Arbitral, international arbitration systems, including investment treaty arbitration, which this is.
Yeah, I think they can be used to create an exclosure, I will say. I guess they are not exclosure in and of themselves, but they are the raw material on which an exclosure can be crafted.
Yeah, also Prospera is not the only private entity trying to use this mechanism to get money from the state. There are also other like investment companies that were involved in this ZIB moment that are asking for like compensations.
And have you guys looked into other instances of similar arrangements? For example, what is now being built in Zanzibar, Tanzania, which is a special zone for governance experimentation. Also a similar arrangement with the government where they just either purchase or rent a piece of land. But I guess they're just more forthcoming in that they want to experiment bolder with governance, much more than, I guess, Prospera does. Are you looking into other examples like that?
I guess that's a very good leeway to the residency, because the idea of the residency is precisely to look into existing and potential case studies that are experimenting in different ways to instantiate some form of new network sovereignty. So Zanzibar, I think, is a very interesting case because it's still in the making. And perhaps there's also like, I mean, we know some of them, so we also have the possibility of like entering discussion and conversation, potentially also influence the way in which it will emerge.
Cool.
Okay, so we can leave the floor to the residency. Thank you very much on BlockchainGov side, and yeah, have a good call. I will leave here.
Thank you, everyone. I'm
Thank
gonna
you.
stop the recording just for.
Can we actually continue the recording if possible?
Yeah,
or should
I'm
I
gonna
start a
stop
new one
it and start a new one.
Perfect. Cool.